The sun that August morning was white and merciless, and omen no one could read. I was 7 years old, and my greatest concern was the insistent buzzing of a cicada hiding in the branches of the old cherry tree in our backyard. The sound was the clock of summer, constant, lazy, eternal. My mother was in the kitchen, and I could smell the gentle scent of rice steaming. It was a day like any other, and this normalcy was the first thing. There was no warning, no siren that could prepare a soul for the end of the world. There was only light. It wasn't sunlight. It was a light that devoured the sun itself. A sickly brightness, a blue-white flash that erased the shadows, for an eternal instant, transformed everything into a photographic negative. I saw the cherry tree shadow burn itself against the wooden wall of our house, a dark, ghostly tattoo that lasted less than the blink. Before my brain could comprehend what my eyes saw, the sound hit me. No, it wasn't a sound. It was a force. A wall of solid air that ripped me from the ground and hurled me against the very wall where the tree's shadow had just died. The world didn't explode. It disintegrated. The noise wasn't a bomb. It was the sound of an entire city screaming as it was ripped to shreds. Wood splintering, glass pulverizing into a cloud of needle, roof tiles turning into projectiles. The air grew thick, hot, and unbreathable, filled with a fine dust that scratched the throat and tasted of crushed stone and something else, something metallic. A smell I had never smelled and that would never leave my nostrils again. When darkness came, it wasn't the darkness of night, but the darkness of burial. The weight of what had once been my home crushed me. The silence that followed was more terrifying than the blast. It was a dull, heavy, hollow. The world ended, and I lay in its grave. I tried to call out to my mother, but the dust muffled my voice, turning my scream into a pathetic wheeze. The only sound I responded to was the distant crackling of the fire, which was beginning to lick the remains of what had been Hiroshima, and the slow drip of something warm on my face. Blood dot my blood. In that moment, beneath the rubble of my own world, the only certainty I had was the pain and the smell of death rising. The cicada had fallen silent forever. My name is Kenji Tanaka. Today, I'm an old man whose hands tremble and whose memory sometimes fail. But that day, I was just a 7-year-old boy, with scraped knees, with an entire universe contained within the small perimeter of our Hiroshima. The world, for me, was the cedarwood scent of our home, the rough, cool feel of the tatami mats beneath my bare feet, and the soft voice of my mother, which was the background melody of my entire existence. We lived in a modest house, made of wood and paper, like so many others. Our walls were thin screens of rice paper that filtered the sunlight, transforming the morning into a soft golden glow that danced across the pond. I remember tracing with my finger the dark wood grain of the pillars that supported our roof, thinking they were like rivers on a map. Our garden wasn't large, but it was my mother's kingdom. She grew essential vegetables and a single stubborn camellia that bloomed with defiant courage. To me, that garden was a jungle, a battlefield for my rag doll, the place where I waged imaginary wars, oblivious to the real war that had taken my father. I barely remembered his face without the help of the faded photograph we kept on a small altar. In the photo, he wore a uniform and a smile that seemed forced, as if he knew he was saying goodbye for a long time. My mother never spoke of him in the past tense. She would say, "When your father returns, he will teach you to fish in the Ota River, or your father would be proud of how strong." He was a promise, a presence made of absence, and I loved him with the fierce devotion a child has for a hero they never truly knew. For me, war wasn't generals or emperors. It was the bitter taste of barley bread, because white rice was for soldiers. It was the patch on my school uniform, sewn so carefully by my mother that it seemed like it. It was the sound of American bombers, the B-29s we called B-SAN, passing so high in the sky they sounded like silverfish swimming in a deep blue ocean. At first, we ran for a bomb shelter, but Hiroshima had been spared so many times that a strange complacency had set in. Planes passed by, but bombs fell elsewhere. We were the lucky city, the adults said. Life went on, adapted. We played Air Alert in the street with my best friend, Akira. He lived next door, and we were Our worlds were woven together by whispered secrets about where to find the best beetles and grandiose plans to one day ride the electric tram that rumbled past at the end of our street. The sound of that tram's bell was the heart of the city for me, a familiar rhythm that promised everything was in its right place. The nights were dark because of the mandatory blackout, and the street, once lit by paper lantern, were now corridors of but inside the house, my mother would light a small oil lamp, her silhouette projected on the paper wall like that of a protective giant, telling me ancient stories of samurai and forest spirits. Tales of a Japan that seemed so distant from our reality of hunger and suppressed fear. Food was our greatest daily concern. I remember the rare joy of a piece of grilled fish or an egg, a luxury my mother saved, lying that she had all. She grew thinner by the month, but her smile never dimmed. It was a smile that was both a shield and a sanctuary. That smile was my home, that house, that garden, that friend, that mother with her weary smile. That was my world, a small, fragile world, built on routine and love, existing under the shadow of a war we didn't understand, in a city that thought it's. No one imagined that the sky, that same vast blue sky where the silver bee sands swam, was about to fall upon us and burn everything, absolutely everything, even the foundations of our memory. Hunger in those days wasn't an absence of food. It was a constant presence. It was a living creature that lived deep within our stomach, knowing, reminding us at every moment of its existence. And humiliation was its shadow, followed. The scene that etched itself in my mind like a preface to hell didn't involve bombs or soldiers, but rather a sack of sweet potatoes and the scornful look of a man who had once greeted us with smile. Mr. Watanabe was the leader of our neighborhood association that hungry him about the war. He was a kimono merchant with an expansive laugh and soft hat. The war transformed him. It gave him an ill-fitting cocky uniform and a petty power he wore. He was the guardian of the ration distribution, which made him a little king in our kingdom of misery. That week, rations were particularly scarce. We waited for hours in a line that crawled under the hot sun, a procession of women, children, and elderly people, their faces etched with exhaustion and anxiety. My mother held my hand tightly, her palm sweaty but firm. She whispered to me to be patient, to be a good boy, because the spirit of Japan lay in our ability to endure. I didn't understand about spirit. I only understood the hole in my belly. When it was finally our turn, Mr. Watanabe looked us up and down, his eyes lingering on my mother's patched kimono. He didn't see us as Gio and Kenji. He saw us as a number, one less mouth to feed, perhaps. He weighed our portion of sweet potatoes on an antique scale, and he did so with deliberate, theatrical slowness. He removed a small potato from our bag, then another. His movements were in the Tanaka family, he said loudly, so everyone in line could hear, always expecting more than they deserve. My mother flinched, but kept her head high. Watanabe-san, we only expect what is due us. My son is growing up. His voice was calm, but I felt his fingers tremble round mine. His response was a sneer. Your son, and your husband, Chiyo-san. Where is the great soldier I saw? We haven't heard from him in a long time. Perhaps he's found a more comfortable place to wait. Perhaps he's no longer serving the emperor with due honor. The venom in his words was palpable. The insinuation was clear and cruel. My father could be a deserter, worse, a coward. In our culture, there was no greater dishonor. The silence in the line grew heavy, filled with pity and fear. No one dared to defend us. To defend us would be to risk one's own ration. I saw something break in my mother's eyes at that. Her mask of calm and resilience cracked for a second, revealing a deep, vulnerable pain. But she didn't cry. She bowed deeply, a bow of submission that made me feel a hot, helpless rage rise in my throat. My husband is an honorable man, she said to the ground. We thank you for the government's generosity, Mr. Watanabe snorted and pushed the half-empty bag toward her. Then teach your son not to have such greedy eyes. We walked home in silence. The sun seemed hotter. I didn't understand the complexities of geopolitics, honor, or military strategy, but I understood, with the brutal clarity of a child, that an evil man had hurt my mother and stolen our food, and no one had done anything. I saw the woman who was my pillar, my sanctuary, diminished to the point where she had to give thanks for an insult. That night, she shared the sweet potatoes and gave me most of them, as always. She tried to smile as we ate, but her smile didn't reach. That night, for the first time, I saw my mother as a person, not a force of nature. I saw her fragility, and it was the first time I felt the true fear of war. Not the fear of silver planes in the sky, but the fear of what war did to people on the ground, turning neighbors into monsters and dignity into something that could be weighed on a scale and deemed insufficient. The bomb hadn't yet fallen, but our little world was already. Emerging from the rubble of my home was like being born again into a dead world. The darkness beneath the wreckage was suffocating, filled with the taste of dust and the smell of splintered. Every movement was agony, with splinters and nails tearing at my skin. The air was thick and hot, and the only thing that kept me going was a single word mantra that my childish mind repeated over and over. Mother in need. I screamed her name until my throat was raw, but the only sound that returned was the muffled, sinister crackle of the fire that was beginning to consume the world outside. Finally, I found a gap, a sliver of dark, reddish light. Using the strength of my panic, I pushed against a charred beam and dragged myself outside, into the landscape of the apocalypse. What I saw first was not destruction, but absence. The absence of everything. My friend Akira's house, which stood next door. The street was gone. The cherry trees, the street light, the neighboring rooftops, everything had been swept away by a divine and monstrous breath. In the place of my neighborhood, there was a desert of smoldering rubble that stretched to a horizon of fire. The sky, once a clear summer blue, was now a low, swirling ceiling of black and purple smoke. The sun a sickly red dye, unable to pierce the pall that covered the city. Then the sounds began. It wasn't the sound of a city, but the sound of hell, a low, constant roar, the sound of 1,000 fires coalescing into a single furnace, the sharp crackle of bamboo exploding in the heat, sounding like sporadic gunfire, the deep, drawn-out groan of distant buildings finally giving in to gravity and collapsing, and beneath it, all their most terrifying sound, human voice. They were moans, then cries of pain, desperate calls for the names of loved ones, a symphony of agony coming from every direction. That was when I saw them, staggering figures emerging from the smoke like ghosts. Their clothes had been burned from their bodies, leaving them naked and blackened. The skin on their arms and faces was loose, hanging in strips like wet rags, and they walked awkwardly, their arms outstretched so the shreds of skin wouldn't stick to them. They didn't scream. Most were shocked silent, their eyes empty. They were a procession of the living dead, and I, a 7-year-old child, couldn't grasp that these monsters were my neighbors, the shopkeepers, the mothers, the fathers. My brain refused to process it. The fear I felt was so absolute it paralyzed. I wanted to return to the dark hole it came from, but the fire was already licking at the wreckage of my home. There was nowhere to go. The world had ended, and I began to walk, or rather, to stumble. Each step was a gamble. The ground was covered in broken tile, melted glass, and pieces of wood with rusty nails sticking up. The heat emanating from the ground burned the soles of my feet. I called out for my mother, my voice a wisp of sound lost in the roar of the dying city. I saw things a child's soul should never see. A horse, still tied to a wrecked car, burning alive. Its screams, all bodies, or what remained of them, trapped beneath charred beam, some so burned they barely seemed to have been people. I saw a mother sitting in the middle of nowhere, cradling the body of a baby that was just a small, blackened bundle, singing a lullaby to the silence. The pain was so vast, so omnipresent, it became the very atmosphere. It was the air we breathed. In that moment, seeing that woman, I didn't feel alone. I was just a small part of an unimaginable collective pain, one cry in a chorus of millions. Maybe you've heard something similar from a grandparent, a neighbor, or even someone in your family. If this memory comes to mind now, share it in the comment. Your story can help others understand that no one goes through a war alone. I continued my search, guided by a primal instinct. I tried to find landmarks, but they had all. The bridge I'd crossed to school was a pile of twisted stone. The market was a square of ash. The city was a map that had been burned, leaving only blank spaces. Then it began to rain. But it wasn't normal rain. Large, heavy, black drops began to fall from the smoky sky. They were sticky, oily, staining everything they touched with a dark. The people round me, mad with thirst from the heat and burn, opened their mouths to the sky, greedily drinking the poisoned water falling from the very cloud that had killed her. For some reason, I was afraid. The rain felt dirty, evil. I covered my head with my hands and continued, the black rain running down my face, mixing with my tears and the blood from my wound. Thirst was like sandpaper in my throat. I was alone on a strange, hostile planet that, hours before, had been my home. The horror didn't lessen, it merely shifted shape. The initial shock gave way to a creeping terror and an exhaustion that weighed more heavily than the rubble. I was a tiny ember of life in an ocean of death, and night was coming, a night that would bring no darkness, only the dancing red glow of our collective future. The search for my mother became the only thing keeping. My body was a collection of sharp pains and an exhaustion so deep it seemed to have seeped into my bone. But the image of her face was a beacon amidst the smoke. I wandered for hours, what felt like an eternity, through that labyrinth of ruin. The day dragged on in a reddish, hellish twilight. Every female figure I saw in the distance, limping or fallen, made my heart race with a mixture of hope and dread. But the world had become a cemetery, and I was a tiny ghost searching for another. The thirst was such torture that I licked the black rain from my own hand, the oily, bitter taste filling my mouth. It was the smell that guided me, not the omnipresent smell of death and smoke, but something fainter, almost imperceptible, the scent of burning gardenia. Near our house, there was a neighbor, the retired calligrapher, who grew a large gardenia. Their scent, on a summer night, was the promise of peace. Now, the smell was of their death, a charred but still distinct scent. Following this ghostly trail, I found myself in what must have been our street. There was nothing, just a plain of broken tiles and blackened wood. But I knew I was in the right place. I recognized the large, smooth stone that had stood at the entrance to our garden, now cracked in half, and there, near where the kitchen had been, I saw a piece of blue fabric with a pattern of tiny cherry blossoms sticking out from under a massive, blackened beam. It was the kimono my mother had been wearing that morning. My heart stopped beating. I began digging with my bare hand, my nails breaking, my fingers bleeding, ignoring the pain. I called out to her, "Mother, Mother," my voice hoarse and desperate. There was a low moan. She was alive. A wave of relief and horror. I managed to clear some smaller debris from her, enough to see her face. It was covered in soot and blood, one of her eyes swollen shut, but it was her. Her lips moved, forming my name, Kenji. Her voice was a whisper, weak as the last wisp of smoke from a candle. She was pinned from the waist down by the main beam of the roof. Her body was broken. I knew, even at 7, there was no way to move her. I was small and weak, and she lifted her hand, and I took it. Her skin was cold despite the heat round her. "Are you okay?" she whispered, and the question broke me. There, crushed, dying, her first and only concern. I couldn't speak, only nodded, the tears finally overcoming the shock, tracing clean spots across the dirt on my face. "You need to get out of here, Kenji," she continued, each word a visible effort. "Go to the river, the water, and then find your uncle in it. He'll take care of you." She coughed, and a trickle of dark blood trickled from the corner of her mouth. Her eyes, the only ones open, searched mine. "Be a good man, live for both of us." I clung to her hand, begging. "No, Mother, don't leave me. I'll get you out of there." She tried to smile, a ghost of the smile that had been my home. "My Kenji, strong. Tell your father that I waited for him." And then the glow in her eyes began. Her breathing became shallower, a flutter, and then stopped. Her grip on her hand loosened. Silence. I stood there, holding my dead mother's hand, amid the ruins of our home, under a sky the color of dried blood. The whole world had become a roar of fire and pain, but in my little universe, all was silent. It was at that moment that the child in me died. The boy who worried about cicadas and believed in his mother's unwavering protection was crushed beneath the... The person who eventually rose was no longer Kenji, the boy. He was a witness, a survivor, and a bearer of guilt. Why me? Why did I, who was in the garden, survive with scratch, while she, who was in the safety of our kitchen, was killed? The difference between life and death was a distance of just a few feet. That question, that random injustice of fate, became the cornerstone of my soul. Her last command, live, became both my sentence and my... Every breath I would take for the rest of my life would be one she could not give. Every meal, one she could not eat. Every moment of joy, tinged with the shadow of the memory of her cold hand in mine. The bomb didn't kill me that day, but it planted a shard in my heart that could never be removed. A fragment of trauma that bleeds to this day. Whenever I close my eyes and smell burning gardenias, letting go of my mother's cold hand was the hardest decision of my... It was a betrayal, an abandonment, but it was also an obedience to her last live. The word echoed in the silence of my mind, a sacred command amidst the chaos. A deafening crash shook me from my torpor. The skeleton of a 3-story building a few meters away, stubbornly clinging to existence, finally gave up. It collapsed in a cloud of dust and spark, sending a wave of heat and debris toward me. Instinct screamed louder than the pain. I ran, without knowing where, only away from the death that pursued me. My goal was the river my mother said would be salvation. But to get there, I would have to cross the heart of the furnace. The city was no longer in flame. The city was the flame. The fire had created its own storm, a monster of wind and heat that roared through the devastated street, sucking the oxygen from the air and turning alleys into superheated wind tunnels. The embers the size of birds soared through the dark sky, and the ground was so hot that every step was torture. I found myself on a street that had once been a bustling commercial area. Now, it was an avenue of fire. The facades of the buildings burned from the inside out, their empty windows like skull eyes glowing with a hungry orange light. The wind from the fire blew with incredible force, and I, small and light, had to crouch to avoid being knocked off. The sound was that of a furious dragon, a continuous roar that vibrated in my chest. I saw other survivors, dark silhouettes running against the flame, some falling, never to rise again. There was no help, no compassion. It was every man for himself in the race against annihilation. To escape a wall of fire blocking my path, I entered a maze of narrow alley. The heat there was unbearable, cooking me alive. My skin, already burned by the flash, seemed... My hair singed, filling the air with a horrible smell. I was certain I would die there, suffocated and roasted. That's when I saw an opening, the entrance to one of the many canals that crisscrossed the city. Without thinking, I dove into the shallow, fetid water, using it as a momentary shield against the flames, and followed its course, stumbling over submerged. Finally, I reached a more open space. Ahead of me was the Io Bridge, or what remained. It was one of Hiroshima's most famous bridges, T-shaped, the precise target to the bomb. Now, it was a bottleneck to hell. Hundreds of people crowded onto its damaged structure, a mass of despair. They were the wounded, the burned, the dying, all trying to cross to the other side, where they believed there would be safety. The scene on the bridge was a Dantean nightmare, their skin hanging off, pushed and trampled one another. Screams of pain mingled with pleas. Many, in unbearable agony from their burn, simply threw themselves from the bridge's railing into the river below, seeking the relief that only death could offer. I had to cross. It was the only way. I plunged into the crowd, a small mouse in a stampede of wounded cattle. I was crushed, kicked, pushed. The air was thick with the smell of blood and burning flesh. I crawled between their legs, beneath fallen bodies, closing my eyes to block out the sight of their contorted. Every inch was a victory. When I finally reached the other end, the sight that awaited me was even more horrific. The river wasn't a river of water. It was a river of bodies, thousands of them. They floated in the dark water, bloated and blackened, gently slapping against each other in the current. Men, women, children. Some clung to pieces of wood, their faint moans barely carrying above the roar of the fire. The water was murky with ash, debris, and in some places. Thirst, however, was a tyrant. It was a physical pain that overcame fear. My mother told me to go to the river. I climbed down the steep, muddy bank among the bodies that had already been deposited there by the tide, and plunged my face into the water, drinking desperate, heedless of the death floating. It was then that the ground beneath my feet gave way. The current, stronger than it seemed, grabbed my exhausted body and pulled me into the mist. Suddenly, I was among them, the dead. Their cold, rubbery bodies brushed against me in the watery dark. I was pulled under, the filthy water filling my mouth and nose. I struggled, but I had no strength left. Looking up, I saw the surface, a blood-red ceiling, receding. I saw the silhouettes of the dead floating above me. This is the end, I thought. I will join them. I will join my mother. And for a second, I felt peace. But her command, live, my instinct kicked in, my arms flailing wildly. My hand hit something solid, a piece of wood. I clung to it with the strength I had left. My head broke the surface. I choked, vomiting river water, breathing the smoky air, clinging to that wreckage, floating in a river of corpse, with my city burning round me. I survived the moment I should have died. I was alive, but life never felt like a blessing again. It just felt like a continuation of that moment. Time lost. I don't know if I lay on the muddy riverbank for hours or a whole day. The sky never truly brightened. The fiery night gave way to a grey morning, a dawn that brought no light, only a different shade of darkness. The sun was a pale, sickly stain behind an impenetrable veil of smoke and dust that covered everything. The world, which had once roared, was now plunged into a deep, unnatural silence. The great fire had devoured everything it could and was now extinguishing itself with a will. The deafening noise of destruction was replaced by its absence. There was no tram bell, no vendor's call, no children's laughter, no dogs. Life had been silent. What remained was a silence that burst in the ears, filled only with the soft sound of the river pushing the dead against the bank, occasionally the low moan of someone nearby, a sound that was less an expression of pain and more the last exhalation of life. My body, the chill of the river water had seeped into my bone, and I shivered uncontrollably despite the heat still emanating from the ruin. The pain from my burns and cuts had become a constant, dull presence, a background noise to my existence. But the greater pain was the emptiness. The adrenaline that had propelled me through the burning city had vanished, leaving behind a hollow void in my chest. I felt no sadness, no anger, no fear. It was as if the explosion had burned not only my city, but also my ability to feel. I was a shell, a passive observer of my own tragedy. I sat and looked out over what remained of Hiroshima. From the river bank, the view was of an endless plain of ash. The city I knew, with its wooden bridges, temple, and curved-roofed houses, had been wiped from the map. It was as if a giant hand had swept everything away, leaving only the skeletons of some concrete buildings stood like tombstones, silent witnesses to the annihilation. Loneliness was the heaviest thing. Before, even when I was alone in my garden, I was never truly alone. There was the sound of my mother in the kitchen, the noise of the street, the presence of the city all round me. Now, the loneliness was absolute. I was surrounded by other people, the living and the dead, but I had never felt so alone in my entire. We were islands of suffering, close but unable to connect. I saw a woman a few feet away from me, rocking back and forth, murmuring a name over and over. I saw a man lying on his back, staring up at the grey sky with eyes that saw nothing else. No one spoke, no one helped. All energy had been spent on survival. There was nothing left for compassion. The world of adult, with its rule, its order, and its promise of safety, had crumbled. They were as lost and helpless. In that moment, I understood that I was on my own. There was no one to tell me what to do, no one to comfort me, no one to protect. My mother's hand, which I had let go of, felt like a phantom absent. The memory of her face, of her last words, began to return, not as a wave of pain, but as fragments of a distant dream. Was it real? Had all of that really happened? I struggled to my feet, my limbs stiff. I walked along the shore, an automaton, aimless. I picked up a broken tile, its surface now porous and grey. It was a piece of someone's home, an entire life, reduced to a fragment of pottery in a boy's hand. The bomb didn't just make a sound when it exploded. The true sound of the bomb was the silence that followed. The silence of the end. The days that followed were a blur of ash and ghost. I followed my mother's orders like an automaton. I walked away from the river of corpses, away from the skeleton of my city. The journey out of Hiroshima was a pilgrimage through a silent purgatory. With each step away from the epicenter, the destruction became a little less absolute. First, there were just smoldering ruins. Then, skeletons of trees. Then, miraculously, a tree with a few charred leaves still clinging to a branch. And finally, after walking for an eternity, I saw the first patch of The shock of that sight was almost as violent as the explosion. Green, the color of life. It seemed an indecency, an insult to the memory of my dead city. How dared the world continue to live when mine had ended? In that moment, I hated that green grass, hated the sound of a bird singing in an intact tree. It was a dissonance my 7-year-old mind could not bear. It was during this long walk that the true lesson of that day began to take shape, not as a clear thought, but I encountered other survivors on the road, a silent procession of refugees in our own land. We were all marked, inside and out. One night, huddled in an abandoned barn with a handful of strangers, an old woman, her face a mask of burn, saw me shivering from cold and hunger. She said nothing. She simply extended a trembling hand and offered me a small rice, blackened at the edges, which she must have been saving for herself. It was probably the only food she had in. I looked at the cake, then into her eyes, and saw there something I thought had been extinguished forever: humanity. She, who had lost everything, was still capable of an act of pure compassion for a stranger boy. That small gesture of kindness amidst utter devastation was my true catharsis. As the years passed, and with a lifetime to reflect, I understood. The bomb that fell on us wasn't the only one that exploded that day. There were two bombs. The first was the one the American. It was the bomb of science, of power, of nuclear fission. It destroyed buildings, melted steel, vaporized human beings, and poisoned the earth. It was an external, impersonal force, monstrous in its effectiveness. We could do nothing against it. But there was a second bomb, and it exploded inside each of us who survived. It was a bomb made of fear, of hate, of pain, of despair. It was the bomb that turned Mr. Watanabe, our neighbor, into a petty tyrant over a few sweet potatoes. It was the bomb that made people trample each other on the bridge, blind to the suffering of others in their own agony. This second bomb had the power to destroy something uranium couldn't touch: our soul. And the great struggle of my life wasn't surviving the first bomb. It was learning to survive the second. What that old woman in the barn taught me, what my own mother taught me with her dying breath, was that faced with absolute horror, we could let this inner bomb consume us, transforming us into selfish animals, filled with bitterness and a thirst or we could do the impossible, diffuse it. We diffused it with a shared morsel of food, with a kind word, with the act of holding a dying man's hand. My mother's sacrifice, using her last breath to give me a path, a direction, a purpose, was the ultimate act of diffusing that bomb. She chose love. She chose hope for me over nothingness for herself. The lesson I carry from that hell is not about the cruelty of war or man's capacity for destruction. We already know that. The intimate lesson, the one engraved in my heart, is that the human capacity for compassion is a force of nature as powerful as an atom splitting. Only it makes no sound. It doesn't burn cities. It quietly rebuilds the world, one soul at a time. I carry the deaths of all I've lost, and the only way to repay it is to live the lesson they taught. No matter how dark the world become, a small act of kindness is the only light that matters, and it's the only weapon that can truly win a war. Today, I have a small garden behind my house. It's a peaceful place, full of light. I planted a camellia in the center, and every spring, when it blooms with its bright red, almost defiant flowers, I sit on the woodman bench and watch. People see me as a quiet old man, a gentle grandfather who has lived a long life. They see my wrinkled hand, my white hair, and assume I'm a man at peace with his past. In a way, they're right. But what they don't see is that the 7-year-old boy still lives inside me. He's always there, with scraped knees and ash-stained face, holding his mother's cold hand. He never grew old, and he never left Hiroshima. I survived, left the city, and rebuilt. I got married, had children, grandchildren. I saw Japan rise from the ashes and become something new. I saw the world change in ways that would have been inconceivable to my parents. I fulfilled my mother's or I lived. But living and returning are two different things. Sometime, at night, when the silence of the house is profound, I close my eyes and can still walk the streets of the city that no longer. I smell grilled fish coming from the kitchen, hear the familiar bell of the electric tram, see the paper lantern swaying gently in the night breeze. I see my friend Akira waving to me from across the street, his smile full of missing teeth. And I see my mother, not as I found her under the rubble, but as she was, standing in our kitchen, a faint smile on her face, the morning sun illuminating. This city in my memory is more real to me than any city of concrete and steel that exists today. It is my lost paradise, and also my prison. What is a survivor, after all? It is not someone who has conquered death. It is someone who has been forced to carry the weight of all those who died, to carry their silent voices into the future. I did not return from that war, because the war never ended. She simply moved inside me, and her battles are fought every day in the silent field. The bomb fell in a single second, but its explosion continues to echo, and I wonder if what I did all these years was truly living, or just learning to breathe outside the fire. If this story touched you, tell us in the comments what struck you most. And if you know someone who carries similar memory, share this story with them. It might just be the silent